Abby, and good morning, everyone. It is a little bit of a change, at least on the topic, and this is the first of, I believe, two presentations, at least, that is touching on the effects of climate change on our parks, and I think it's important at this occasion to actually start thinking, or at least talk about a lot of research that has been going on already, looking at long-term effects of climate change on our cultural and natural resources. And the effects are already dramatic worldwide and in the United States. And that's the only reason to highlight the range and the scale that I chose to start with showing a graph. So this is where our comfort zone was in the past. Somewhere around the 1960s, we permanently stepped into a zone which is warm and getting warmer. CO2 concentrations, which are fueling temperatures, are rising. Temperatures are on this axis. And this plot was generated sometime around 2010. In 2016, we are outside of this plot with our CO2 in atmosphere at around 406 ppm or so, maybe even more. And for our cultural and natural resources, the effects are not only large in terms of scale, as is the case with the infestation with mountain pine beetle, shown here for the Rocky Mountain National Park. The research, our attempts to develop climate change adaptation strategies are extremely complex in terms of modeling, in terms of the number of variables and categories that we need to take into account, and we'll hear more about that from our research group from University of Oregon, Robert Melnick and Knocker. In contrast, the study, or more of a discussion that I want to talk about today, has a very narrow focus, only on wood in our built environment. So thinking about Liz's presentation and all the wood in Manny Glacier Hotel and most other park structures. I'm limiting or focusing only on wood in ground exposure, or in ground contact, or above ground exposure, so not on wood that is buried, so no archaeological artifacts or wood that is immersed in water. I also chose to consider only those deterioration mechanisms that are capable of creating structural damage, and typically those are fungi and few insects. And we will look at what we already know from our experience working with historic buildings, but also from the science on these deteriorating organisms. And then we'll try to understand what is already happening at present, and based on that, try to come up with at least some understanding of what future has for wood in these buildings, and maybe try to formulate some of the recommendations for how to address these problems already in a preventive way in our park structures. And because fungi and insects are very different, I'll try to keep them and talk about them separately. There are many different types of fungi. We usually refer to them and distinguish them based on how they appear or what kind of decay pattern they produce in wood. And what we see here is typical brown rot fungi. Regardless of species, they have a very similar set of growth requirements. They require wood for food, they need oxygen, and most importantly, they need moisture and temperature. That's important because of climate change. They prefer moisture contents of around like 30% based on wood weight in order to be able to infest wood. So we don't see them as much here in New Mexico, for example. But then once they're established, they can grow at, let's say, 20% minimum moisture content. And they also prefer optimum temperatures of around 80 Fahrenheit. So the relationship between growth requirements, namely temperature and moisture and wood decay in buildings, is obvious, but it is a little bit more complicated, and I just wanted to kind of like talk about growth conditions, moisture and temperature at three different levels that we usually refer to when talking about buildings, and one being microclimate, then mesoclimate, and macroclimate. So microclimate is typically determined by the conditions on the wood itself, so moisture and temperature on the surface and within the wood. That is the critical level at which wood will decay or not. At the very next level is mesoclimate, which is determined by the surrounding, the setting of the building. So if there is a lot of vegetation, if there is a water body close by, if there are structural details which trap moisture, they are going to determine mesoclimate and also influence microclimate. But then at the very highest level, there is the effect of macroclimate. And macroclimate is determined by temperature and precipitation. And that's where we see the effect of climate change. And for everyone working with wood, that relationship between the climate and the amount of decay is kind of intuitive. But in 1971, a wood scientist, Theodore Schaefer, which was, I believe, with Forest Products Lab in Madison, Wisconsin at the time, he tried and successfully developed an equation that describes this relationship. And he used records of temperature, climate records for temperature and precipitation. In this equation here, which is really not that complicated, he worked with annual averages, and he used 30, I think around 30 year worth climate record for the whole United States. And that allowed him to calculate climate indexes which describe the potential for decay depending on the geographic region, on the location of the building, which is related to the climate. And then he plotted all of those data for United States, and he distinguished three regions. He said if the climate index is less than 35, we have no decay. If the climate index is between 35 and 70, we see medium risk, and then in these dark regions, more than 70, there is high risk of decay. And what that means is, for instance, this blue star is where approximately Las Vegas would be, and that corresponds to the climate index of 0. So nothing ever happens in Las Vegas, at least when wood decay. But West Palm Beach, Florida, 137.5. And this has been extremely useful and widely used. And these maps were developed for other regions worldwide. They were used to model building performance. They're still used a lot. But actually, let's stay here for a while. But around 2000, or maybe before that, scientists started realizing that there was a discrepancy between what they're observing in the field and what Schaefer indexes are saying. And that was especially the case in Canada because it's north, and global warming is kind of like more pronounced, or we see more of a change in the northern parts. And their government scientists in 2008 published a study that what they actually did, they revisited and they recalculated Schaefer's indexes, but now using climate data from 1970 to 2000. And we go back to that graph that we saw at the beginning. So we already see warming, global warming during that period. And not surprisingly, they saw increase in Schaefer's indexes, and that explained their field observations. So another study by Forest Products Lab followed and confirmed the effects in the United States. And I'm sorry that these maps are not side by side, but basically we see increase in indexes and also shifts in these regions, most notably in the north. Neither group or both groups were careful not to say that this was due to climate change. Also, they left it open. But then there were other studies throughout the world that followed, and researchers were actually trying to figure out whether it was due to climate change. And in the end, there was consensus, yes, it was. Especially there was a German group which went even further, and they said the quantity and the quality of change in decay indexes actually does depend on the geographic position and on the amount of climate change that will take place in the future. So what that means is perhaps, or can be explained if we look at the climate change itself. So on this upper map, we see what has already happened. This is observed temperature change throughout the country with apparent warming in red for in the north and then in the central parts. And then I'm not sure that everybody can see that but there is a map in the left corner below which shows one of the worst case scenarios for 2100. And here we see most of the warming taking place again in the north and especially in the west of the country. If you look at what's happening with precipitation, we see increase in, or we already know that there has been more precipitation than what historic record was in the north mostly, but then there is this kind of like a reverse scenario by 2100 where we will see a lot of precipitation, high increase in the central and mid part of the country, and then very drastic decrease in the west. So we could, knowing what fungi like and what is happening with climate change, we could make some kind of educated guess for each particular region. I'm sure everyone is looking at their state and their park and trying to figure out what's going to happen. But what some researchers actually did, they plugged in all this data, all these projections that we already have for their particular areas of interest, and that has been done for Australia, European Union, Norway, so on. And they have a pretty good idea what decay potential is going to be like for their region. And especially important is this map that I'm showing here. And let me see the full title of the project. This was the study that was done by European Commission on the project that is known as Noah's Ark, and probably many of us have come across that. The project was titled Global Climate Change Impact on Built Heritage and Cultural Landscapes. So this research was done specifically to figure out what will happen in Europe, and this is far future 2099. And interestingly, north and west of Europe are going to experience 50% increase in decay, and south of Europe and west Europe 30% decrease. That's what modeling says. And based on that, we can maybe guess that in the United States, this decay risk potential will change for warmer and dry climates by actually going down, and will increase in those regions which will experience annual precipitation. Moving to insects, while fungi generally share similar life cycle and their deterioration patterns are kind of similar, wood-boring insects have a lot of diversity in terms of geographic ranges, decay patterns, distribution, and so on. And there are many different species that attack wood in North America, but let's focus just on those that are especially significant, and those would be termites, carpenter ants, and deathwatch, and the powder post beetles or wood-boring beetles in general. So what is unfortunate about insects is that the amount of available research for individual species is usually proportional to the economic damage they inflict, and at the present our understanding of climate change effects and insect activity is usually limited to our understanding of their biology and ecology. So let's just say what kind of changes we might see in the future. For example, wood-boring beetles are really diverse. They usually have very limited geographic ranges. We usually don't consider them a big hazard in terms of structural damage. There are also, of course, exceptions, such as in Pacific Northwest, where we have this beetle here. Often they have clear dietary restrictions, such for this beetle here, which only feeds on the sapwood of softwood species. But what is important to consider and to keep in mind when we talk about historic buildings is that these insects are very difficult to detect, to control, and to prevent their attack, which makes them important pests to historic wood, fabric, and wood artifacts. They're especially important pests in museum collections. Carpenter ants are present throughout the country. They can cause significant structural damage, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. What is interesting and why it is important to understand their habits and their life is that they are proportionally more active and frequent in maybe national parks because they like forests. That's where they live, regardless of whether it's a historic building or just a dead wood. And termites are ones that are really a concern. They cause $1 billion damage, and we will only talk about subterranean termites. They're the most destructive. For those reasons, they also have been studied more extensively than other insects. National Park Service was also active in integrating research and cultural resource management by developing efficient treatments that were used, for example, for Statue of Liberty, National Monument control of termite infestation some years ago. And we also have a better understanding of their requirements and their distribution. On this map, we see an infestation probability map that is used in building codes, actually. Earlier this year, an interesting study came out of a research team from the University of Florida. And what they looked at was what is the survival and the distribution of most important termites in the United States going to be like, and what is the wood consumption rate, which means the damage to wood in buildings in general, going to be like depending on climate change. And the results were interesting. They confirmed the expectations, and there are as many other insects moving northwards. So instead of having them only up to here, for example, certain species, they will slowly at least have a potential to move further north. The study also established that the critical parameter for most of those termites is going to be the low winter temperatures, because those low winter temperatures are lethal to termites, and that's what is critical for controlling their populations. So those are going to rise, again, another indication that they are moving northward. And this study didn't really look at Formosan termite, which is just worth mentioning, having this species on everyone's map, because this is the most destructive species, far more destructive than any of the native species. It was introduced to the United States sometimes after the Second World War, and the distribution range has been just expanding ever since. They are also important because they are destructive to wood in all cultural resources. It is, I think, especially in French Quarter, in historic French Quarter, There were instances when they would attack not only historic buildings, but also cypress trees and live oak trees, and just any wood. So with insects, based on what we know and what we understand, and based on our experience with historic buildings, it is pretty certain that increased average temperatures, including annual average temperatures, summer temperatures, minimum winter temperatures, all of that is going to affect their activity, more deterioration. They will have a longer reproductive season, which means bigger population, again, more damage, shorter biological cycle, which again means bigger population, higher number of generations. In some instances, those climates that are going to become favorable for fungi infestations are going to be good for some insects, such as carpenter ants, which like high moisture. Geographic range will move northward, and then there is some elevated risk of non-native invasive species, and what we already know is happening not only for insects but for bears is appearance of new hybrid species that might be much more destructive than anything we already have. So, based on what we know, or at least the knowledge base that we already built that is accessible to us, at present, what we can do in our parks, I think it is really important to understand that we've seen all of this just at someone else's park. So it is the communication and finding a way to share that knowledge and technologies which exist is really important when it comes to decay mechanisms, to species distribution, to growth requirements. This is something that should be at least present as a concern, as something to look for when doing regular inspection and maintenance. So these early signs of infestations don't go unnoticed. It's really important, and these are preventive measures that everyone can incorporate. And then at some other level, monitoring both short and long term, including non-destructive testing. Again, knowledge transfer, dissemination is really important, and use of preventive and remedial treatments that we already have and know a lot about. About future, as we already saw, climate-based modeling is really a powerful tool. Apart from that, looking at material resilience, and not only material but structural, because no matter how much we agree or not on that, structures were built or were not built for certain deterioration patterns that we see here. And we need to revisit those material and structural properties, and also to look at new materials and new ways of modifying structures if we have to. Monitoring of insect vectors is something that we should learn from biologists. What was done at the Noah's Ark project was very interesting. They actually introduced classification for their historic buildings in the European Union based on sensitivity to climate change. So they were classified as robust or with high, medium, low sensitivity. And I don't know how efficient that or helpful that is, but in combination with something as mapping, it might maybe be for developing models and for future strategies. And in the end, I still think that, as with all the other issues that touch on climate change, it's really most important to ask good questions. And those questions usually have to be well informed. So thank you, and I would be glad to answer questions.